How does one properly debate? Let me walk you through it. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. For today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the most important and the most valuable skill known as the art of debate. Now, we're not going to be talking about the modern picture of what a debate is, which is just lambasting your opponent and trying to make them sound or look like an idiot. Rather, we're going to, in an attempt to return to, discuss the true purpose and the true format of an authentic, genuine debate or argument, that being pursuing and seeking truth, rather than trying to make your opponent look like a fool, look like an idiot. So in order to do that, we're going to go over the structure of a debate or the framing of a debate and how you can best make a case that, one, addresses the topic, but also doesn't compromise on the ideas you believe would best suit that pursuit of truth. So at the very, very top of every page, at the very top, to serve as a header for the entire debate, not just your case, but the opposing case as well, and then, of course, for the audience to consider, is going to be the resolution. It's going to be the topic. It's going to be the guardrails, you can think of it, as for that discussion. Because without those guardrails, without that topic, then you and your opponent are going to be talking past each other, bringing up different problems, and then ultimately nothing gets resolved and no conclusions can be made. Which is why it's so important whenever your opponent, or even if you start to slip into different conversations, different topics that have zero relevance, whether it's implicit or explicit, to that resolution, you should correct yourself or correct your opponent, or just don't even address the irrelevant points. It would be more wise and more conducive to explain exactly how those points aren't relevant to the topic, but that would be to your decision whether or not to address the relevancy of those points. So that is for both sides, applicable to both sides, for the entire argument. Now we get to your case. So your case is going to be designed not to make your opponent look incorrect or like a fool, but to show how your case best answers the resolution, the question being asked, or the problem needing to be resolved, whilst not compromising on that pursuit of truth. And at the top of your case is going to be what is called the value. Now, the value can be something, generally is best to be something that is pretty encompassing and not vague, but like an eternal principle. Something like individualism or collectivism or freedom or liberty. The value is going to be exactly what you want to observe as a priority. It's what you think is the most valuable, not pursuit, because the ultimate pursuit is truth, but the most valuable facet of human existence or of observation of reality that you believe is worth protecting or facilitating, which is why it needs to be general. After your value, you're going to have your criterion, and your criterion is going to be the method by which you're going to provide for your value. So your value is going to be something general, like individualism, and your criterion is going to be somewhat general, but almost like a plan, almost like a one or two sentence statement. Sometimes it can be a singular principle, a singular, maybe school of thought that will facilitate your value. So for individualism, your criterion, if your value is individualism, your criterion could be something like separation of powers, bicameral Congress, a constitutional republic. That would be your criterion. It would be whatever mode you think best fits providing for that value. And after those two are settled, which you should spend, depending on the complexity of your value and criterion, a minute and a half, maybe 3 minutes maximum. After that, you get down into your contentions. And your first contention, to the benefit of the audience, should be dedicated to explaining how your criterion effectively facilitates your value. So, contention one should be something to the effect of, using this kind of hypothetical: freedom or individualism, my value, is best facilitated by a constitutional republic, my criterion, because whenever a constitutional republic limits government, individualism is propagated and excelled. And then beneath that, you can obviously state a claim, but it's not going to be as self-evident if you don't provide evidence of that claim. So underneath that contention, you would have some basis of that statement. That's recommended. I mean, you can go without evidence for it, but having evidence for that statement, having evidence for that claim is going to be greatly to your benefit. So under that first contention, you could cite anything from the founding generation. You could cite the Federalist Papers. You could cite the U.S. Constitution. You could cite to other constitutional republics in history and show how they prioritized individualism. And then with like a sub point, probably not a second contention, but underneath that first contention, you could have sub point A, which would explain further how individualism and constitutional republic, your value and criterion, should be facilitated, why they should be a top priority. And under the first contention, realistically, again, this depends on the complexity of your value and criterion, but realistically, you should have maybe 3 to 4 contentions maximum explaining your position. If you go beyond that, you start losing the audience, you start getting into obscure ideas, which lends itself to getting off topic, getting away from the resolution, which perverts the whole purpose of the debate, of the argument. So do your best. I know sometimes it's pretty difficult, but do your best to make your contentions, your case, concise. And if you have to go beyond 3 or 4 contentions, again, do your best to make those additional contentions concise and direct. Because despite whether we like it or not, the more direct you can be about your positions, the more persuasive you're going to be. The longer you have to talk about it, we have an instinct of, okay, this guy's kind of jabbering on, sometimes repeating himself, makes me think there's something he's trying to slip in here through this kind of repetitive statements. Kind of like what I'm doing right now. That there's something about his position that isn't making sense or isn't self-evident and intuitive. So he has to kind of keep jabbering on to make it appear like what he's saying is true or self-evident or in any way a pursuit of truth. Which is why you should limit yourself to 3, 4 contentions maximum. So you have your value at the top. That's your top priority. The facet of existence and reality that you think is worth pursuing above many others. Definitely over what your opponent is pursuing. Then you have your criterion, which is how you're going to pursue and facilitate your value. And you have your first contention, which should explain how your criterion provides for your value. After the first contention, this is after considering whether or not you want to have a sub A under that first contention, explaining further how or why your value and criterion should be provided for and accepted and adopted. Your second contention should explain how no other system can provide for your value, which is why your criterion has to be applied. That if we try to use any other criterion, if we try to use any other method, it's not going to work. And then again, you'll want to provide evidence for that. You can allude to the Federalist Papers again. So as an example, to use the hypothetical, value individualism, criterion constitutional republic. After the first contention, showing historical examples of constitutional republics facilitating individualism, the second contention would be something to the effect of, we've tried individualism in something like a democracy or a communitarian type of government, and it didn't work. And because those examples don't work, we can reasonably project that other types, if trying to facilitate individualism, will also fail. Now, you have to be careful with that because sometimes that can be considered a hasty generalization. So make sure your argument there and your evidence is locked tight. And this is, of course, just for this hypothetical. But you do have to be very careful about slipping into hasty generalizations, trying to apply a universal idea because of a conclusion from a few examples. Now, with your third contention, and where I would recommend cutting off the case, with your third contention, it should be a summary of why the value and criterion are worth pursuing. And it sounds redundant, but we have to remember that contention is likely going to be the last impression that the audience is going to have. It's going to be the last piece of argument, the last piece of the case that the onlookers and your opposition is going to be hearing, which is why you would want to dedicate that time, if not in a third contention, just as float of your presentation, why it needs to be a reminder why your value and your criterion are worth pursuing. Now, you don't have to reiterate contention 1 and contention 2, but you can further demonstrate how contentions 1 and 2 play into providing and supporting that value and criterion. If you want to go on to contention 4 to be maybe more aggressive against the opposition, say y'all share cases before the debate and the argument to really dive into the individual qualities of each other's case that are conflicting, then maybe you could use a fourth contention to directly address how your value and criterion are maybe hurt by their case, or maybe you can use the fourth contention as a rebuttal to what they believe should be the top priority value and criterion, so on and so forth. That would probably be a better use of a fourth contention. But that would be the structure of an honest, truth-pursuing debate and argument. Have your value, the top priority that you're trying to facilitate, which should be somewhat general, not too ambiguous. Then you have the criterion, which is the method by which you're going to provide for that value, which is still going to be somewhat general, but needs to provide a direct path or avenue that your value can be attained. Your first contention should explain how the criterion facilitates the value. And if you want to have subpoints further explaining that, you can. Then the second contention explains how your value can't be provided for by any other criterion. And then your third contention it doesn't recite, but it should bolster why the criterion should be facilitated, and how contentions 1 and 2 demonstrate that. And then, of course, if you want to add a fourth contention, which is optional, you can use that mainly for kind of an early rebuttal of what the opposing case is going to be. Now, are there other structures to go about debating? Sure, but they haven't proven to be as conducive and as diplomatic as this format, because you have an actual structured case that each side can go point by point on addressing, appealing to the resolution, and then ultimately trying, in an honest pursuit of truth, come to a resolve of that topic being asked or that problem being obviated. So if you have any other formats, I'm more than willing to hear them, but so far, this format, this style of case, I've found to be the most conducive, the most authentic and honest in that true legitimate pursuit of debate, which would be the seeking of truth. So if you have any questions about this topic, maybe you'd like me to elaborate further. If you have any questions about preceding lectures, or maybe there's a legal topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, please post those down in the comments. And I hope it goes without saying, but debate and learning how to structure an argument is so incremental and integral to being a lawyer, to being counsel, because of course the laws are self-evident and proving of themselves, but if you don't know the laws and if you don't know how to present them in a manner such as this that shows inherently your truth pursuit, you're going to lose the hearts and the minds of those who, with good presentation, would be persuaded to your side. And when the law is on your side, you've earned that, which is why it's good to learn how to debate. But I'll go ahead and repeat myself. If you have any questions about this topic, questions about previous lectures, or maybe there's a legal topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post those down in the comments, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to provide you with the necessary skills, such as debate, and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and until I see y'all in the next lecture for the next topic, I bid you all farewell.